let's start this lesson with doing a little refactoring. So if we take a look at these two tests, we can see that in both tests we repeat the logic to mount the component, which takes several lines. So I prefer to move this logic into a separate function that we can reuse. So I'm going to create the function with the name mount activity item component. And in here I'm going to paste that logic to mount this component and return the result of this mount. And then in the first test we can call this function to get the mounted component, like so. But if we take a look at the second test, in here we can see that we not only need to mount the component, but we also need to have access to the activity that we pass into activity item component as a prop during rendering. So I'm going to create a separate function for it, which is going to create new activity objects and call it create activity. Next, let's take this whole object and move it into a separate function. Right here, let's declare a new function with the name create activity and paste that object with all the fields. So now that we have the function which creates new activities, in here instead of creating activity object manually, let's use that function. So I'm going to call the function create activity, which is going to return new activity object. But we actually need to have a way to pass activity objects into mount activity item function from outside. So the activity object will be used during component rendering. So let's go back to mount activity item function definition and declare new parameter, which is going to take an object with overridden fields for the activity object. And this object is going to have the following type. I'm going to use default TypeScript type for this called partial. This is a generic type, which takes another object type. And by using the following notation, we actually get the object type, which can consist of any properties that exist on activity type. But this is not necessary to have all the properties on the activity object, because in some cases we will need to override only some of the fields of the activity objects. And then I'm going to take this activity overrides param and pass it down further into create activity function, because this is the function which is responsible for creating new activity objects. And this way we're gonna have an opportunity to pass some overrides to the newly created activity object from outside. And then I'm basically going to destructure received object with overrides, and this way we are merging overridden fields with default fields of the activity object, while overwriting default fields at the same time. And since while being in this function we are already inside of activity creation context, I prefer to rename this parameter on simply overrides, because it is kind of assumed that these overrides are used for activity object. And then after making all these changes in the second test, we can create activity object firstly, and then pass this object into mount activity item function in order to mount activity item component with activity object prop. And then we can simply use this activity object in any expectations down here. So now let's declare a new testing scenario where we're going to check that activity item component will show activity name. And if we'll take a look at the implementation of activity item component, in here we're seeing that we are displaying the name of the activity by referencing the name property. So this is going to be pretty easy to check. I'm going to create new testing scenario and describe it as it shows activity name. And all we have to do in here is to mount activity item component first. And then I'm going to declare the constant, which is going to store activity name. And then let's also combine the second and the third parts of this test. So we're going to mount activity item component and at the same time write an expectation where we're going to check that the content of this component is going to contain activity name. And as you can see, while calling mount activity item component, we have also passed custom activity name. So the new activity will be created with this name. And that means that this name should appear in the rendered markup of the component. And there we go, we are seeing that the test is passing. And the moment I'm going to remove this property name from the component, in this case, test is going to throw an error because there will be no activity name found in the rendered component markup. So let's revert these changes, remove modifier only from the test, and at the end run all tests in the project. They are all passing. We can move on to the next lesson.